This is what an $8 trillion mistake looks like. It's a number so big it's almost meaningless. It's the estimated cost of America's post-9/11 wars. Sprawling nation-building efforts tied to securing resources that spiraled into a financial black hole. Now, some influential voices in Washington are proposing a similar playbook for a nation crumbling right in America's backyard, Venezuela. The idea sounds deceptively simple. Step in, stabilize the country, and turn on the taps to the largest oil reserves on Earth. Proponents say American companies can just rebuild Venezuela's oil sector and get the crude flowing again. But there's a catch. The math in Venezuela is far worse than it ever was in the Middle East. The prize isn't just buried under collapsed infrastructure, it's buried under a mountain of debt you can't see. This isn't a story about a rescue mission, it's a story about a trap baited with the illusion of cheap oil that all but guarantees a multi-trillion-dollar failure. This is Venezuela's oil trap, and the same logic that led America into its last trillion-dollar quagmire is pulling it straight towards this one. The Golden Age and the original sin. To understand the trap, you have to understand the prize. For a good part of the 20th century, Venezuela was the envy of Latin America. It was a stable democracy, a founding member of OPEC, and so rich from oil, it was a magnet for immigrants. By the 1970s, it had one of the highest GDPs per capita in the region, which at times matched or even surpassed that of some southern European countries. The engine of all this wealth was Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. In the late 1990s, right before Hugo Chavez came to power, Venezuela was a global energy powerhouse, producing around 3 million barrels of oil every single day. It was a sophisticated world-class operation. But that wealth was also a poison. Economists have a name for it: Dutch disease. The flood of money from a single resource, oil, made Venezuela's currency so strong that it became cheaper to import everything else than to make it at home. Farming, manufacturing, and other vital parts of the economy withered. The entire country became dangerously dependent on the price of a single commodity, creating a system that was rich but incredibly fragile. Oil has historically made up over 90% of the country's export revenue, a staggering dependence that set the stage for total disaster. That disaster began to unfold when Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. He promised to use Venezuela's oil wealth to fund a socialist revolution. His method? Treating PDVSA not as a national asset to be carefully managed, but as a political piggy bank to be smashed open. The real breaking point was the 2002-2003 general strike, when much of the PDVSA workforce walked out to protest his government. In retaliation, Chavez fired around 18,000 of the company's most experienced employees, nearly half its workforce. These weren't just managers. They were the geologists, engineers, and technicians who actually knew how to run one of the most complex oil industries on the planet. They were replaced with political loyalists, many of whom had no idea how to manage the nation's crumbling infrastructure. The results were immediate and catastrophic. Institutional knowledge vanished, maintenance schedules were ignored, and long-term investments were scrapped. The company that was once the envy of the world began to rot from the inside out. By the time Chavez died in 2013, production had already fallen from its peak, though it was still hovering around a respectable 2.7 million barrels per day. The foundation, however, was cracking. Under Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, those cracks shattered. The final blow came in 2014 when a global oil glut sent prices crashing. For a healthy country, it would have been a tough recession. For Venezuela, it was an apocalypse. The river of petrodollars the only thing holding the economy together, slowed to a trickle. The government, cut off from its only real source of income, just started printing money, triggering one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in modern history. The nation's infrastructure, already neglected for a decade, went into terminal decay. Power grids failed, pipelines corroded, and refineries rusted into ghost towns. The oil industry itself entered a death spiral. Production plummeted. By early 2026, output has been hovering between 1 and 1.2 million barrels per day. That's a jaw-dropping decline of roughly 60-70% from its peak. The country with the world's largest proven oil reserves was producing just around 1% of the world's oil. Venezuela had fallen into its own trap. The source of its incredible wealth had become the cause of its complete and utter ruin. So why should the United States care about this internal collapse? Because a plan for Venezuela is quietly taking shape in foreign policy circles, and it looks eerily familiar. It's a playbook for intervention and reconstruction, and it's the same one America used in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's be crystal clear about what that playbook cost. According to the Costs of War project at Brown University, the post-9/11 wars have cost the United States an estimated $8 trillion. That number doesn't just include military spending. It also covers interest on war debt, homeland security costs, and the staggering long-term price of caring for veterans. Those interventions were sold on national security, but they were deeply tied to securing influence in resource-rich regions. The result was 2 decades of nation-building that left behind enormous debt and 2 countries in turmoil. The playbook rests on one big assumption: that military force can pave the way for economic reconstruction, which will then pay for itself through natural resources. It's a tempting story. Use American power to unlock a nation's wealth, and everyone wins. It was the logic in the Middle East. And it's the exact same logic being whispered about Venezuela, but this time the numbers are even worse. Let's imagine a scenario that's been kicked around by experts. A US-led effort creates a political transition in Venezuela. The stated goal: stabilize the nation and revive its oil industry. This is where the Iraq playbook gets dusted off and where the trap springs open. Rebuilding Venezuela's oil industry isn't like flipping a switch. It would be one of the most complex industrial reconstruction projects in history. The physical decay is breathtaking. Pipelines are corroded beyond repair. Refineries are monuments to rust, and crucial equipment has been stolen or has simply rotted away. One analysis from the energy firm Rystad Energy estimates it would take a staggering $183 billion in investment between 2026 and 2040 just to get production back to its 1990s peak of around 3 million barrels per day. That includes tens of billions for pipelines and storage, with another $30 to $35 billion needed in the first few years just to get started. This is a 15-year, multi-billion-dollar per year commitment. And then there's the oil itself. Around 3/4 of Venezuela's reserves are extra heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt. This isn't the light, sweet crude of Texas or Saudi Arabia. It's a thick, tar-like sludge that's a nightmare to extract and refine. It requires specialized, expensive facilities that are in short supply globally and have decayed in Venezuela. Getting it out of the ground and to the coast is the first colossal hurdle. The prize isn't a treasure chest waiting to be opened. It's a wreck at the bottom of the ocean that requires a salvage operation of epic proportions, one that would cost hundreds of billions of dollars before anyone sees a single dollar in profit. But the cost of rebuilding is only the first problem. The second and much bigger one is debt. Venezuela isn't just broke, it's buried under one of the most complicated debt piles on the planet. Estimates put Venezuela's total external debt somewhere between $150 and $170 billion. That figure includes about $60 billion in defaulted government and PDVSA bonds. It also includes billions in loans from countries like China and Russia, often backed by promises of future oil deliveries, creating a tangled web of competing claims. On top of that, there are billions in legal claims from international companies whose assets were seized. A feeding frenzy is already underway for Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset, the U.S.-based refiner Citgo, with court claims from creditors reaching an evolving figure of around $19 billion. Any new government or international coalition wouldn't just be rebuilding an oil industry, they would be inheriting a catastrophic sovereign default. With a debt-to-GDP ratio estimated to be around 200%, analysts predict that any deal would require creditors to take a massive loss, a haircut of at least 50% on what they're owed. Convincing thousands of different bondholders, companies, and foreign governments to agree to that will be a legal and diplomatic nightmare that could drag on for decades. This means any money from a rebuilt oil sector wouldn't go to the Venezuelan people or to the companies doing the work. For the foreseeable future, every drop of oil would be spoken for, siphoned off, to pay a mountain of old debts. Before we get to the final fatal calculation, take a moment to think about the sheer scale of this problem. If you appreciate analyses that cut through the headlines and give you the hard numbers, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's the best way to support our work and make sure you don't miss what's next. This brings us to the final, crushing reality of Venezuela's oil trap. Even if you could pour in the hundreds of billions to rebuild, and even if you could navigate the labyrinth of debt, the whole thing is still likely to be a spectacular financial failure. The economics of oil have changed. The era of scarcity that defined the 20th century is over, replaced by an era of abundance, largely thanks to the U.S. shale revolution. This new reality puts a ceiling on oil prices. While prices will always fluctuate, the constant specter of a global supply glut keeps long-term expectations moderate. Now do the math. The cost to produce Venezuela's heavy crude is high. The upfront investment to even get it flowing is enormous. On top of that, a huge chunk of any revenue would have to be diverted to service that $170 billion mountain of debt. When you combine the astronomical investment, the high production costs, the massive debt, and a world of moderate oil prices, the conclusion is hard to escape. The oil is an illusion. It is an uneconomic prize. The path to breaking even, let alone turning a profit, looks nearly impossible. Private companies know this. They'd be incredibly hesitant to sink billions into a country with a history of seizing assets and a political situation that remains a tinderbox, especially when there are safer, more profitable places to invest. They'd be walking into a high-risk, low-reward nightmare. The illusion of oil. So this is the Venezuela oil trap. The idea that America can just repeat the Middle East playbook to unlock a treasure trove of oil is a dangerous fantasy. Let's recap the facts. First, the prize itself, PDVSA, was systematically gutted by political mismanagement, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell. Second, the physical infrastructure is so decayed that it would require an investment approaching $200 billion and more than a decade of work just to get it back to its former glory. Third, the nation is drowning in up to $170 billion of external debt, which means any future oil money is already spent. And finally, the math just doesn't work. The combination of massive costs and moderate oil prices makes the entire venture economically unworkable. The siren song of Venezuela's oil is the same one that lured America into Iraq and Afghanistan, the belief that power can unlock prosperity. But that playbook already led to an $8 trillion failure. In Venezuela, where the infrastructure is more broken and the debt is far higher, that same playbook is destined to create another catastrophic blunder. The price is an illusion, the oil is a trap, and the numbers don't lie. The real question isn't how to get Venezuela's oil, but why, after so many costly failures, is this flawed playbook even on the table? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below.